Are you tired of hand watering your rows of crops? Are you tired of overhead watering options leaving your plants soggy and wet and thus prone to disease, rot, and fungus? Today, I'm going to show you how to install an automatic drip irrigation system for row crops. This comes with all the advantages that drip provides, including delivering water directly to the roots of the plants so that the foliage may remain dry. Okay, let's get started. We went with a customized row crop kit based off the measurements that we took. This includes just the length of the beds to determine how much drip tape we need and the distance from the water source to the furthest bed so we can determine how much mainline tubing we need. Then we just count the number of rows we're going to have, which is 4 in this case, to determine how many fittings and end caps we're going to need for our drip tape, and if we need any elbows or T's for our mainline tubing. Taking measurements actually does make up most of the design process. If you'd like to learn our simple method to easily design your own drip irrigation system, check out the video there in the top right. It'll walk you through step by step. The first thing I like to do is organize everything into like piles. Thus I put my couplings with my couplings, my takeoff adapters with my takeoff adapters, my end plugs with my end plugs. This makes finding them when I need them much easier. The system we're going to install today is our standard drip irrigation kit for row crops. And believe it or not, everything we need is right here on the table. We have our mainline tubing, our 5/8 drip tape, the part that actually delivers water to the plants. And even though it's not included in the kit, we brought a timer because we want to automate the system. We have our punch that punches the hole in our mainline tubing so that we can connect these takeoff adapters. Takeoff adapters connect the tape to the main line. We have a couple tape couplings just in case we need to repair any damage or make a bad cut that we don't need. We have the end cap for our mainline tubing and the end caps for our drip tape so that they can both be closed off and then pressurized. Here are the parts that make up our head assembly. We have our backflow preventer to prevent water from flowing back into the potable water supply from the irrigation system. Then we have our filter to protect the system from debris, our pressure regulator to keep everything regulated, dripping evenly, and to protect the system from potentially high pressure. And then finally, our hose by tubing adapter, which is the part that connects our mainline tubing to the rest of the head assembly. And here we have some goof plugs. Goof plugs, as the name implies, are there just in case you punch a hole that you no longer need or make by accident. You just pop a goof plug in and fill that hole right up. Then finally, just a pair of scissors so we can make a cut at our drip tape and our main line where we want them to stop. One tip while you're organizing your parts is to place your mainline tubing directly in the sun. As tubing gets warm, it relaxes and gets much easier to work with. So what you do is place it in direct sunlight, cut the straps, and then continue organizing your parts and installing the head assembly. By the time you're ready to run your mainline tubing, it'll be softer and much easier to work with. With our parts organized, it's time to install our head assembly so we can connect everything to the water source. We're going to start with our optional timer. The timer is the only part in the head assembly that is rated for constant pressure. The other parts have to be relieved of pressure when the system is not in use. That means if you're using a timer, it always goes first. Next up is our backflow preventer. You'll remember the backflow preventer keeps potentially tainted irrigation water from flowing back into the potable water supply. You'll always want one of these. When installing your head assembly components, remember it's best to go finger tight and then maybe another quarter to half turn after that. If you tighten up the parts too much, you can cause damage or leaking. Remember, when installing your head assembly components, check the female connection of each one for the gasket. That's how hose-threaded components seal. After the backflow preventer comes the filter. Remember, the filter filters out any debris that might otherwise get into the irrigation system. After the filter comes our pressure regulator. The pressure regulator regulates downstream pressure to keep everything dripping evenly and helps protect your components from potentially high pressure damage. The last piece in our head assembly is our hose by tubing adapter, and this is the part that connects our mainline tubing to the rest of the head assembly and the water source. Okay, now we're ready to run our mainline tubing. Now that our mainline tubing has been in the sun for a while, you can see how much relaxed it's become. Because of this, it's going to be much easier to work with than when it's cold and tightly coiled. To connect your mainline tubing, simply turn the locking nut so it's all the way extracted, push the tubing on over the barb, and then turn the locking nut to secure the tubing on over the barb. Just like this. If you have any difficulty with this part, dip the end of the tubing into a cup or pan of very hot water. Be careful not to burn yourself. This will soften up the tubing considerably. and make it much easier to push on over the barb. All right, now let's run our main line, cap it off, and we'll be ready to install our drip tape. And here we are at the end of the last row. Here, we're going to cut into the mainline tubing so we can apply our end cap. Just like before, use a back and forth motion while applying pressure, and then thread the locking nut to secure it onto the fitting. With our mainline ran and capped off, it's time to install our actual drip tape. To connect our drip tape to the mainline is actually quite easy. All we need to do is punch a hole in the side of the mainline with this punch, then insert the barbed end of this takeoff adapter, and connect our tape to this end. If you make a mistake while punching in your main line, you're going to want to fill that hole. You can simply use one of the 1/4 inch goof plugs, and it's much easier to get them in if you're using the nose pliers. When filling a hole made by the 1/4 inch punch or by the barb on your takeoff adapters, use the large end of the goof plug. With our takeoff adapters installed, it is time to connect our drip tape. To do so, simply remove the bands from your roll of tape. Then you push the tape on over the barb just like you do your tubing fittings. One important thing when installing drip tape is to make sure that the emitters are facing up when you install it. There's two ways to tell where the emitters are. One, you can physically see the emitter and the small hole where the water comes out. The other is to look for the stripes on the tape. Just like we did with the tubing fittings, we're going to push the end of the tape on over the takeoff adapter barb and then turn the locking nut to secure it in place. All right, I'll show you how. Now, let's unroll this row by walking it down, and then I'll show you how to cap it off at the end. At the end of the row, all you have to do is cut the tape and then install this end plug to cap it off. When cutting the drip tape to install the plug, just be careful not to cut into one of the emitters. The end caps go on the exact same way the adapters do. Simply push the tubing on over the barb and secure it in place with the locking nut. The end plugs we use have a little loop at the end. You can use that to stake the tape in place if you need to. In some systems, this will be important, as thermal expansion and contraction will displace the tape over time. So you can stick a stake through that loop to hold it in place. Now I'll repeat that same process for the rest of the rows. We're almost ready for our first watering cycle, but first we want to do a system flush. The system flush is to get any debris that got in during installation, and some always will, out of the system before we operate it. To perform a system flush, simply unthread the end caps or pull off your end plugs, turn the water on, and let water flush out of the end for a few moments, long enough for the turbulence inside to dislodge any debris, send it right out the end. Then turn off the water, recap your system, and you're ready for your first watering cycle. Now we're ready for our first watering cycle. When you do your first watering cycle, it's a great time to walk the system and make sure everything's working as it should. Check your head assembly for any leaks, check your joints and connections where your tape joins your tubing, make sure your emitters are facing up on your tape. Make sure your emitters are dripping as they should be. And that's all it takes to install an automatic drip irrigation system for your row crops. Now, you don't have to worry about hand watering ever again, or overhead watering options that are less than desirable due to wet foliage causing rot, disease, and fungus growth. And one of the great things is you'll now have the ability to automatically feed your plant fertilizers through this system. If you'd like to learn how to automatically inject fertilizer and nutrients into your drip irrigation system, check out our video on the EasyFlow fertilizer injector right here. If you're ready to dive right in and recapture all that time spent hand watering, you can check out our row crop drip irrigation kits right here.